Thomas Chen stared at the holographic nutritional analysis floating above his workstation, trying to make sense of dietary requirements that seemed to change daily based on criteria he couldn't begin to understand. Working as a nutritional consultant aboard the research station Prometheus had seemed straightforward when he'd accepted the assignment: develop sustainable food systems for mixed human-alien crews during extended deep space missions. The reality involved attempting to balance the metabolic needs of species whose biology operated on principles that made human physiology look simple by comparison. "Thomas," came the melodic voice of his research partner from across their shared laboratory space. Dr. Nixa Velthera approached his workstation with the purposeful stride of someone who had important questions that needed immediate answers. Her pointed ears caught the artificial lighting in ways that Thomas had learned to find both elegant and slightly distracting during their 3 months of collaboration. "Let me guess," Thomas said without looking up from his analysis. "You need me to recalculate the protein synthesis rates for Keflarian metabolic cycles again because someone discovered that emotional states affect digestive efficiency?" "Actually, I have a different question today," Nixa replied, settling into the chair beside his workstation with the kind of focused attention that Thomas had learned meant she was about to ask something that would challenge his understanding of basic biological processes. Thomas saved his work and turned to face her, noting how Nixa's luminous skin seemed brighter than usual, which typically indicated either excitement about a research breakthrough or preparation to discuss topics that pushed the boundaries of their professional collaboration. "What kind of different question?" "A practical inquiry about human reproductive physiology as it relates to nutritional sustainability," Nixa said with the clinical precision that characterized all Keflarian scientific discourse, though Thomas detected undertones that suggested this particular inquiry was more personal than her usual theoretical discussions. Thomas felt his eyebrows rise toward his hairline. "Reproductive physiology. Specifically, male human lactation capabilities under optimal nutritional conditions," Nixa continued with the same matter-of-fact tone she used to discuss amino acid sequences, though her luminescence increased in ways that Thomas was beginning to associate with subjects that made her nervous despite her scientific confidence. "Male human lactation," Thomas repeated slowly, wondering if something had been lost in translation between Keflarian and human biological terminology. "Nixa, human males don't lactate. That's not how our reproductive systems work." Nixa tilted her head in a gesture Thomas recognized as her processing unexpected information. "But surely under specific hormonal conditions and nutritional supplementation, human males could produce nutritional secretions adequate for supporting dependent offspring?" "No," Thomas said with the patience of someone who had spent months explaining human biology to aliens whose reproductive systems operated on completely different principles. "Male humans don't have the physiological structures necessary for milk production. That's exclusively a female capability, and only under specific reproductive circumstances." "Fascinating," Nixa murmured, making notes on her data pad with the enthusiasm of someone discovering gaps in previously accepted scientific knowledge. "So when you say, 'Do you have enough milk for two?' the question would be meaningless if directed toward a human male." Thomas stared at her, trying to figure out why she was asking about a phrase he'd never heard in any context that made sense. "Where did you encounter that particular question?" "Theoretical research into human partnership sustainability," Nixa replied, though her evasive tone suggested the research was less theoretical than she was willing to admit. "I have been investigating human capacity for providing comprehensive nutritional support during extended collaborative relationships." "Extended collaborative relationships," Thomas echoed, sensing that they were discussing something significantly more complex than standard nutritional consulting. "Are we talking about professional partnerships or something more personal?" Nixa's luminescence flickered in what Thomas had learned to recognize as the Keflarian equivalent of blushing. The distinction between professional and personal partnerships becomes less clear during extended deep space missions where crew members must provide mutual support across multiple biological and emotional dimensions. Thomas felt reality shifting in ways that made him suspect their conversation was heading toward territory that their professional relationship hadn't previously explored. "Nixa, are you asking whether I could provide nutritional support for someone during an extended partnership?" "I am asking," Nixa said with increasing directness, whether human males possess any capacity for producing nutritional substances that could supplement standard dietary requirements during periods of increased biological demand. What kind of increased biological demand? Nixa was quiet for a moment, her expression cycling through what appeared to be internal debate between scientific objectivity and personal vulnerability. Keflarian reproductive physiology involves phases that require enhanced nutritional support, she said finally. During these phases, standard dietary intake becomes insufficient, and traditional Keflarian partnerships involve shared nutritional production between partners to maintain optimal health. Thomas began to understand that Nixa's seemingly academic questions about human biology were actually practical inquiries about compatibility between human and Keflarian partners during specific biological phases. And you're wondering whether a human partner could provide the kind of nutritional supplementation that a Keflarian partner would typically supply? Precisely, Nixa confirmed, though her tone suggested the question was more personally urgent than purely academic. My research into human biological capabilities has been inconclusive regarding male nutritional production potential. Thomas realized that his alien research partner was asking, in the careful language of scientific inquiry, whether he could care for a Keflarian female during reproductive phases that required nutritional support beyond standard meal planning. Nixa, he said carefully, are we discussing theoretical research, or are you asking about specific biological needs that might affect our working relationship? Her luminescence flared dramatically before settling into patterns that Thomas recognized as nervousness mixed with hope. Would your answer change depending on whether the inquiry was theoretical or practical? Thomas considered the question, aware that his response would determine whether their professional collaboration continued as formal research partnership or evolved into something significantly more personal. It might, he admitted. If we're talking about actual biological needs rather than academic research, then I'd want to understand exactly what kind of support you're asking about and whether I'm capable of providing it. And if you were capable, then I'd want to know why you chose to approach this as a scientific inquiry rather than a personal conversation. Nixa smiled with what appeared to be relief mixed with continued nervousness. Because scientific methodology provides structured approaches to evaluating compatibility factors that informal personal discussion might overlook. If we are going to explore whether human Keflarian partnerships can address both professional and biological requirements, systematic evaluation seems prudent. Thomas felt his pulse quicken as he realized that Nixa was proposing to study their potential romantic compatibility using the same rigorous approach she applied to nutritional research. You want to conduct experiments to determine whether I could provide the kind of care you need during Keflarian reproductive phases? I want to conduct comprehensive compatibility assessment to determine whether our professional partnership could successfully expand to encompass personal partnership that addresses both human and Keflarian biological requirements. Comprehensive compatibility assessment, Thomas repeated, wondering what he was agreeing to. What would that involve exactly? Systematic evaluation of your physiological responses to providing care under increasingly demanding conditions, Nixa explained with growing confidence. Nutritional supplementation experiments, stress response testing, endurance evaluation, and proximity tolerance assessment. You want to test whether I can handle the biological and emotional demands of caring for a Keflarian female during reproductive phases. I want to test whether you want to handle such demands, Nixa corrected gently. Capability without willingness would be insufficient for successful partnership. Thomas looked at Nixa's hopeful expression, at the research laboratory that had become the center of his life for the past 3 months, at the data displays showing nutritional analyses that had gradually become more personal than professional. And if I pass your tests? Then we explore whether systematic scientific methodology can provide a foundation for relationships that transcend species boundaries, Nixa replied with a smile that made her luminescence flare in ways that had nothing to do with clinical research. Thomas realized that his alien colleague was proposing to study their romantic compatibility with the same thoroughness she applied to analyzing amino acid sequences, and despite the unconventional approach, he found himself intrigued by the possibility of discovering what lay beneath her scientific curiosity. All right, Dr. Velthera, he said, matching her formal tone despite the personal nature of their discussion. Let's design some experiments to test human Keflarian partnership compatibility. But I want full disclosure about what I'm agreeing to participate in. Full disclosure about experimental parameters, or full disclosure about why I am personally invested in the research outcomes. Both, Thomas said firmly. Nixa's smile was radiant enough to trigger several monitoring systems in their laboratory equipment. Then perhaps we should begin with the most important variable in any meaningful research. The acknowledgement that I am hoping our experiments will prove that what I feel for you extends far beyond professional appreciation. Thomas felt his heart rate spike in ways that would definitely register on their monitoring equipment. In that case, Dr. Velthera, I think we should design some very thorough experiments indeed. Thomas woke to the sound of his alarm having been replaced by what appeared to be a Keflarian meditation chime, which he discovered was just the first of many modifications Nixa had made to their shared laboratory environment in the name of creating optimal conditions for comprehensive compatibility assessment. "Good morning, Thomas," she called from the nutrition preparation station she'd apparently been working at since before dawn. "I have prepared your baseline dietary supplement according to the experimental protocol we discussed yesterday." Thomas looked at the meal Nixa had prepared, noting that it contained significantly more protein and what appeared to be several substances he didn't recognize. "Remind me what this is supposed to test." Phase 1 involves evaluating your physiological responses to enhanced nutritional intake designed to optimize human caregiving capabilities, Nixa explained with the clinical precision that made even breakfast sound like a scientific procedure. The supplements include amino acids that promote energy stability and hormonal balance supportive of protective behaviors. Protective behaviors. The capacity to provide sustained care and support during periods of increased dependency, Nixa clarified, though Thomas detected undertones suggesting the dependency in question was more specific than she was initially willing to acknowledge. Thomas tasted the breakfast, surprised to find that despite its experimental nature, it was actually quite good. "You've been researching human nutritional preferences." Comprehensive compatibility assessment requires understanding not just biological requirements but preferences and comfort factors that affect willingness to maintain dietary protocols over extended periods, Nixa replied, settling beside him with her own meal, which appeared to be considerably more complex than his. "And your meal?" "Keflarian nutritional requirements during research phases," she said, though Thomas noticed she seemed more interested in monitoring his reactions to his breakfast than focusing on her own nutrition. The morning proceeded with what Nixa described as baseline capability assessment, which involved Thomas performing routine tasks while sensors monitored everything from his heart rate to stress hormone levels. What made the assessment unusual was how many of the tasks seemed designed to evaluate his responses to providing care and support rather than measuring standard physical or intellectual capabilities. "Carry this across the laboratory," Nixa instructed, handing him what appeared to be a weighted container designed to simulate something that required careful handling. "The objective is to transport it without disruption while maintaining awareness of environmental factors that might affect successful delivery." Thomas completed the task while noting that Nixa's monitoring equipment was tracking not just his physical coordination but his attention to her comfort and safety during the exercise. "Now attempt the same task while I provide additional variables," Nixa continued, moving to walk closely beside him during the second attempt. Her proximity made the simple task considerably more complex, as Thomas found himself hyper-aware of her presence and unconsciously adjusting his movements to accommodate her space and comfort. "Interesting results," she murmured, reviewing data that Thomas couldn't see but suspected showed increased protective responses triggered by her nearness. "What exactly are you measuring?" "Instinctive caregiving behaviors under various stress conditions," Nixa replied, though her tone suggested she was pleased with whatever the data revealed. "Phase 2 will involve evaluating your responses to scenarios requiring sustained attention to another individual's needs." Phase 2 proved to be exactly as personal as Thomas had feared and somehow more intimate than he'd expected. Nixa's experimental design required them to spend the afternoon in what she described as proximity sustainability testing, which involved sharing workspace while she simulated various conditions that required Thomas's attention and care. The scenarios are designed to evaluate your psychological and physiological responses to providing support during periods when a partner might experience increased vulnerability, she explained as she began what appeared to be a simulation of Keflarian biological processes that required external assistance. Thomas found himself helping Nixa with tasks that seemed designed to test his willingness to provide personal care without questioning the necessity or appropriateness of such assistance. Her experimental methodology gradually revealed that Keflarian reproductive phases involved dependencies that required partner support in ways that went far beyond emotional comfort. "Your stress levels remain remarkably stable," Nixa observed as Thomas helped her with a complex nutritional preparation that required precise coordination between two people. "Most individuals show increased anxiety when required to provide intimate assistance to someone from a different species. Maybe I'm getting comfortable with the idea of providing intimate assistance," Thomas replied, then immediately wondered if he'd revealed more about his feelings than their professional relationship could accommodate. Nixa's luminescence flared in what Thomas was learning to recognize as pleased surprise. That response suggests positive adaptation to interspecies caregiving requirements. Is that what we're calling this? Interspecies caregiving? We are calling it whatever terminology makes you comfortable with participating in increasingly personal experiments, Nixa said with a directness that made Thomas realize their scientific methodology was becoming a framework for exploring feelings that neither of them had been prepared to acknowledge directly. And what if I said I was comfortable with calling it something more personal than caregiving? Nixa paused in her data collection, turning to look at Thomas with an expression that mixed scientific curiosity with personal hope. "What would you prefer to call it?" "I'd prefer to call it figuring out whether two people from different planets can care about each other enough to make the practical aspects work," Thomas said, surprising himself with his honesty. "Care about each other," Nixa repeated thoughtfully. "That variable was not included in my original experimental design. Maybe it should have been the primary variable from the beginning." Nixa set down her monitoring equipment and moved closer to Thomas, her expression shifting from scientific objectivity to personal vulnerability. "Thomas, I should clarify the practical aspects you mentioned. Keflarian reproductive phases require not just emotional support but sustained nutritional supplementation that must be provided by a compatible partner. The biological demands are considerable and ongoing." "How considerable and how ongoing?" "Sufficient to require lifestyle modifications, dietary adjustments, and time commitments that would fundamentally alter your daily routine for extended periods," she explained with careful honesty. "What I am asking you to consider is not merely romantic partnership but comprehensive biological partnership that involves significant personal sacrifice." Thomas looked at Nixa's worried expression, realizing that her scientific approach to evaluating their compatibility stemmed from genuine concern about requesting support that might be beyond what he was willing or able to provide. "Nixa," he said gently, "are you asking whether I'd be willing to reorganize my life around supporting you through biological phases that require intensive partner care? I am asking whether such reorganization would feel like sacrifice or like the natural expression of feelings that make comprehensive partnership desirable despite practical challenges." Thomas felt something click into place as he understood that Nixa's systematic evaluation of his caregiving capabilities was her way of determining whether his interest in her was strong enough to sustain the. Thomas woke to the sound of his alarm having been replaced by what appeared to be a Keflarian meditation chime, which he discovered was just the first of many modifications Nixa had made to their shared laboratory environment in the name of creating optimal conditions for comprehensive compatibility assessment. "Good morning, Thomas," she called from the nutrition preparation station she'd apparently been working at since before dawn. "I have prepared your baseline dietary supplement according to the experimental protocol we discussed yesterday." Thomas looked at the meal Nixa had prepared, noting that it contained significantly more protein and what appeared to be several substances he didn't recognize. "Remind me what this is supposed to test." Phase 1 involves evaluating your physiological responses to enhanced nutritional intake designed to optimize human caregiving capabilities, Nixa explained with the clinical precision that made even breakfast sound like a scientific procedure. The supplements include amino acids that promote energy stability and hormonal balance supportive of protective behaviors. Protective behaviors? The capacity to provide sustained care and support during periods of increased dependency, Nixa clarified, though Thomas detected undertones suggesting the dependency in question was more specific than she was initially willing to acknowledge. Thomas tasted the breakfast, surprised to find that despite its experimental nature, it was actually quite good. You've been researching human nutritional preferences. Comprehensive compatibility assessment requires understanding not just biological requirements but preferences and comfort factors that affect willingness to maintain dietary protocols over extended periods, Nixa replied, settling beside him with her own meal, which appeared to be considerably more. Thomas discovered that living with someone whose biology operated on principles he barely understood was like taking a crash course in advanced alien physiology while simultaneously navigating the most complex relationship of his life. Nixa's Phase 3 compatibility assessment involved sharing quarters that she had modified with equipment designed to monitor everything from air quality to stress hormone levels, creating an environment that was part research laboratory and part intimate living space. Your cortisol levels show remarkable stability, Nixa observed over breakfast on their third day of cohabitation, consulting readings from sensors that apparently tracked his stress responses throughout the night. Most humans demonstrate significant anxiety when adapting to close quarters with non-human partners. Maybe I'm not most humans, Thomas replied, noting how domestic their morning routine had become despite the scientific equipment surrounding them. Or maybe I'm comfortable living with you. Comfortable enough to adapt to increasing care requirements? Nixa asked with the careful tone that Thomas was learning indicated she was about to reveal additional complexities in their arrangement. What kind of increasing care requirements? Nixa set down her data pad and looked at Thomas with an expression that mixed scientific precision with personal vulnerability. Keflarian reproductive phases progress through stages that require increasingly intensive partner support. What you have experienced so far represents baseline requirements. The demands will escalate significantly over the coming weeks. Thomas felt his understanding shift as he realized that Nixa's systematic evaluation of his caregiving capabilities had been preparation for biological needs that extended far beyond anything he had initially comprehended. How significantly? Nutritional requirements will double. Sleep patterns will require coordination to ensure optimal rest cycles. Physical contact will become necessary for hormonal regulation rather than optional for emotional comfort. Nixa's luminescence increased as she spoke, indicating either excitement or nervousness about revealing these details. Physical contact for hormonal regulation. Keflarian physiology during reproductive phases requires regular tactile stimulation to maintain biochemical balance, she explained with clinical precision that didn't quite mask personal anticipation. Touch from a compatible partner triggers hormonal responses that regulate everything from sleep cycles to immune function. Thomas processed this information, beginning to understand that Nixa's experiments had been evaluating not just his willingness to provide care but his capacity to sustain intimate physical and emotional partnership during extended periods of biological dependency. So when you asked about enough milk for two, you were actually asking whether I could handle comprehensive caregiving responsibilities that would require complete lifestyle integration. I was asking whether your feelings for me were sufficient to sustain partnership that goes beyond human relationship models to encompass biological interdependence, Nixa clarified. Keflarian partnerships during reproductive phases require levels of care and commitment that many species find overwhelming. Thomas stood and moved to sit beside Nixa, noting how her luminescence flared in response to his proximity. And you've been systematically testing whether I'm capable of that level of commitment? I have been systematically testing whether you want to be capable of it, she corrected gently. Biological capability without emotional investment leads to partnerships that fail under stress. I needed to understand whether your interest in me could develop into the kind of deep commitment that makes intensive caregiving feel like natural expression of love rather than burdensome obligation. Thomas reached for her hand, marveling at the warmth and slight electromagnetic sensation that accompanied contact with Keflarian skin. What have your experiments concluded? They have concluded that you demonstrate remarkable capacity for adaptation when motivated by genuine care, Nixa replied, her fingers intertwining with his. Your stress responses decrease rather than increase when providing support, suggesting that caregiving behaviors feel natural rather than forced. Most significantly, your biochemical markers indicate growing emotional attachment rather than resentment as care requirements increase. Because taking care of you doesn't feel like work, Thomas said with growing understanding. It feels like getting to be useful to someone I care about. Precisely. And that distinction is critical for successful Keflarian partnerships. Nix's expression became more personal as she continued. Thomas, I should be completely honest about what comes next. The reproductive phase I am entering will require your constant attention for several weeks. Your sleep will be interrupted to provide care during my vulnerable periods. Your diet will need to be modified to optimize your capacity to produce the nutritional supplements I will require. Your schedule will be entirely subordinated to my biological needs. Thomas felt the full weight of what Nixa was asking settle around him. You're asking whether I'm willing to reorganize my entire life around supporting you through a biological process that requires total partner dedication. I am asking whether you love me enough to accept that loving a Keflarian female means becoming essential to her survival rather than simply compatible with her preferences. Thomas looked at Nix's worried expression, at the monitoring equipment that surrounded them, at the life he had built that was about to be completely transformed by the needs of someone whose biology made human reproductive support seem simple by comparison. Nixa, he said carefully, are you asking because you need someone to provide care, or because you want me specifically to be the person who provides it? I am asking because 3 months of systematic evaluation have convinced me that I am completely in love with you, and because Keflarian reproductive phases cannot be safely navigated without a committed partner, she replied with honesty that made her luminescence flare dramatically. I need comprehensive biological support, but I want that support to come from someone who understands that providing it is an expression of love rather than a research obligation. Thomas felt something settle in his chest as he realized that Nix's scientific approach to their relationship had been her way of ensuring that his feelings were strong enough to sustain the kind of partnership her biology required. Then yes, he said firmly. Yes, I want to be the person who provides whatever support you need. Not because I'm participating in an experiment, but because taking care of you has become the most important thing I do. Nix's smile was radiant enough to trigger alerts from several monitoring systems. Even knowing that the demands will test every limit of your physical and emotional capacity? Especially knowing that, Thomas replied. Because if the person I love needs comprehensive care, then providing it becomes the definition of what love means. Nixa moved closer to him, her luminescence creating patterns that Thomas was beginning to recognize as deep contentment mixed with anticipation. Thomas, I should warn you that once Keflarian reproductive bonding begins, the biological connection becomes permanent. What you are agreeing to is not temporary caregiving but lifestyle transformation that will affect every aspect of your existence. Are you trying to scare me away? I am trying to ensure that you understand the magnitude of what you are choosing, she said seriously. Keflarian partnerships are not casual relationships but biological mergers that require complete commitment from both individuals. Thomas considered this, aware that he was being asked to make a decision that would fundamentally alter the trajectory of his life in ways he couldn't fully comprehend. Nixa, he said finally, 3 months ago I thought I was taking a routine assignment as a nutritional consultant. Instead, I found someone whose curiosity and intelligence and systematic approach to understanding the universe made me want to reorganize everything I thought I knew about relationships. If that's not already biological merger, then I don't know what is. And if the merger becomes even more complete? If your biology begins to adapt to support mine in ways that create permanent physiological changes? Then I guess I'll discover what it means to love someone so thoroughly that even my biochemistry wants to take care of them. Nix's laugh was musical enough to create harmonic resonance in their monitoring equipment. Thomas, I believe you have just passed every compatibility assessment I could possibly design. Does that mean the experiments are over? It means the experiments are about to become very personal indeed, she replied with a smile that made Thomas's pulse quicken in ways that would definitely register on their biometric sensors. Thomas woke to find Nix's luminescence had shifted to patterns he'd never seen before, pulsing with rhythms that seemed to synchronize with her breathing and heartbeat. The monitoring equipment around their shared quarters hummed with increased activity, tracking biological changes that indicated her reproductive phase had entered its most intensive stage. "How are you feeling?" he asked softly, noting how she seemed to glow brighter in response to his voice. "Different," she replied, her usual scientific precision replaced by something more vulnerable and immediate. "The hormonal changes are more dramatic than I anticipated. My body is responding to your presence in ways that go beyond the theoretical frameworks I studied." Thomas sat up to look at her more closely, observing how her skin seemed to pulse with internal light and her breathing had taken on deeper, more synchronized patterns. "What do you need from me?" "Everything," she said with honesty that would have seemed overwhelming a week ago but now felt like natural progression of their deepening connection. "My biochemistry is shifting to integrate with yours. I need sustained physical contact, nutritional supplementation that requires your biological contribution, and emotional support that stabilizes my hormonal fluctuations." Thomas moved closer, noting how his proximity caused her luminescence to settle into calmer patterns. "Your biological contribution?" "Keflarian reproductive phases require nutritional elements that must be produced by a compatible partner," Nixa explained, her voice carrying new harmonics that made her accent even more musical. "Your body has been adapting to produce compounds that my physiology needs for successful completion of this biological cycle." "My body has been adapting." The dietary supplements, the proximity testing, the stress evaluations. All of it was designed to trigger physiological changes that would enable you to provide comprehensive biological support, she admitted with a smile that mixed scientific satisfaction with personal affection. "Your hormone levels, enzyme production, and even your sleep cycles have been gradually modified to complement my requirements." Thomas felt a moment of shock as he realized the extent to which their scientific partnership had been transforming his biology without his conscious awareness. "You've been changing my biochemistry?" "I have been providing conditions that allow your biochemistry to change itself in response to sustained partnership with a Keflarian female," Nixa corrected gently. "The adaptations occur naturally when humans and Keflarians maintain close emotional and physical proximity over extended periods." "And if I hadn't wanted these changes?" "Then your biology would have resisted the adaptations, the compatibility assessments would have shown negative results, and I would have concluded that our partnership was not viable for long-term success." Her expression became more serious. "Thomas, the changes only occur when both partners unconsciously desire the biological integration necessary for sustainable interspecies bonding." Thomas considered this, aware that his understanding of their relationship was shifting to encompass realities he had never imagined. "So the experiments weren't just testing my willingness to provide care, they were testing whether my biology wanted to bond with yours. They were testing whether your feelings for me were deep enough to trigger physiological changes that make comprehensive caregiving not just possible but biochemically rewarding," Nixa confirmed. "Love that's strong enough to alter biology represents commitment that can sustain the demands of Keflarian reproductive partnerships." Thomas looked at his hands, wondering what invisible changes had been occurring while he focused on learning to care for someone whose needs extended far beyond human relationship models. "What changes have occurred?" "Your hormone production now includes compounds that stabilize my emotional state during vulnerable phases. Your nutritional absorption has optimized to enable you to produce supplemental nutrients that I require. Your sleep patterns have synchronized with mine to ensure optimal recovery cycles for both of us." Nixa moved closer, her luminescence responding to his proximity with patterns that seemed almost musical. "Most importantly, your stress responses now decrease rather than increase when providing intensive care, indicating that your biochemistry recognizes caregiving as natural rather than burdensome." "So when you asked if I had enough milk for two, you were asking whether my biology had adapted enough to actually provide the nutritional supplementation you need?" "I was asking whether your feelings for me had become strong enough to trigger biological changes that make comprehensive partnership possible rather than theoretical," she corrected with growing confidence. "And the answer appears to be yes." Thomas reached for her, marveling at how contact with her skin now produced sensations of warmth and rightness that seemed to originate from cellular level. "How do you know?" Because your biochemical markers show complete compatibility with my reproductive requirements, your stress levels remain stable despite intensive caregiving demands, and your own biology now depends on sustained contact with mine for optimal function. Her smile was radiant enough to create harmonic resonance throughout their monitoring equipment. Thomas, we are no longer two individuals choosing to care for each other, we have become a bonded biological system that functions optimally when integrated. Thomas felt the truth of this statement in ways that went beyond intellectual understanding. The past weeks of caring for Nixa had felt not like sacrifice but like fulfilling fundamental biological imperatives he hadn't known he possessed. And this is permanent. This is what Keflarian partnerships become when successful, biological mergers that create new forms of consciousness based on shared care and mutual dependence. Nixa's expression became tender as she continued. Thomas, what you have given me goes beyond the nutritional and emotional support I required. You have allowed your entire biological identity to reshape itself around compatibility with mine. Because I love you enough to become whoever I need to be to take care of you properly. Because you love me enough to discover that taking care of me is who you were meant to become, she corrected gently. The adaptations feel natural rather than forced because they represent the expression of your deepest values rather than changes imposed from outside. Thomas pulled her closer, noting how their synchronized breathing and heart rates created a sense of biological harmony that felt more complete than anything he had experienced in previous relationships. So what happens now? Now we present our research findings to the Joint Scientific Council as evidence that human-Keflarian partnerships are not only possible but represent a new model for interspecies relationships based on biological integration rather than cultural accommodation, Nixa replied with the satisfaction of someone whose hypothesis had been thoroughly proven. And personally, we continue to explore what it means to love someone so completely that your biology redesigns itself to ensure their well-being, she said with a smile that made Thomas's modified biochemistry respond with waves of contentment and protectiveness. Thomas marveled at how completely his life had transformed from routine nutritional consulting to pioneering a new form of interspecies partnership that challenged everything both species thought they understood about love, commitment, and the biological foundations of meaningful relationships. Nixa. Yes. Next time someone asks if I have enough milk for two, I'm going to tell them that when you love someone enough, your body figures out how to produce whatever they need. Her laugh created harmonic patterns in her luminescence that Thomas's adapted physiology recognized as pure joy. I think, Thomas, that might be the most important scientific discovery either of us has ever made. As their monitoring equipment registered the biochemical harmony that characterized successful Keflarian bonding, Thomas reflected on how his alien partner's systematic approach to love had taught him that sometimes the most profound connections require not just emotional commitment but biological courage, the willingness to let love literally transform who you are at the cellular level. It was, he decided, the most beautiful experiment he'd ever been privileged to participate in.